Have you ever wondered how people hunted in the Wild West? Now I'm going to reveal the secrets of this process, which are sure to shock you. The Wild West in winter is not just a landscape covered in snow. It's a whole book written in tracks on a white canvas. Every footprint, every broken branch was a letter in the alphabet of survival that mountain hunters and trappers had to know by heart. Their lives depended not on the power of their shot, but on their ability to read these icy pages and understand the language of silent nature. In harsh conditions where one mistake could be fatal, tracking game became a high art, an intellectual duel with nature itself. Trappers did not just search for prey, they became part of the winter world, dissolving into it and thinking like those they were following. It was a test of endurance, patience, and above all, a deep understanding of the surrounding world. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how an experienced trapper could determine not only the species and size of the game from a single track, but also its condition, intentions, and even how long ago it passed by, turning ordinary snow into a detailed map of events. I will reveal the most closely guarded, whispered secret of the old experienced trapper hunters. For them, snow was not just frozen water or a white blanket, but a real living parchment of nature, on which a detailed chronicle of the wild was written every minute by an invisible hand. They intuitively distinguished dozens of different types and conditions of snow by texture and density, and each of them eloquently told its own unique story about what had been happening around them in the last few hours. Snow was the language in which nature spoke to those who knew how to read and understand it. Fluffy and light powdery fresh snow, for example, perfectly preserved animal tracks with photographic accuracy and detail, allowing an experienced eye to see the smallest details of a paw or hoof print. But such treacherous snow also inevitably meant that any sound of footsteps or the crack of a branch carried very far in the silence, and it was necessary to approach a cautious target with particular, heightened caution, holding one's breath. It was a severe test of the hunter's absolute silence and extreme accuracy of every movement, where one mistake could cost him his prey. Dense, wet, sticky snow, on the other hand, blurred and obscured the clear contours of the tracks, making identification difficult, but it molded perfectly under weight, allowing the depth of the footprint to be accurately determined and, therefore, the approximate weight and size of the creature. It also effectively muffled the sounds of the pursuer's footsteps, giving the patient hunter a small but valuable tactical advantage in sound masking of his approach. Each type of snow dictated and required its own specific tracking tactics and its own individual approach to prey. Nast, a hard crust of ice on the surface of the snow, was both the worst enemy and the best friend of an experienced trapper, depending on the situation. It made human movement incredibly noisy, crunchy, and physically difficult, breaking legs. But if the pursued target fell through it under its weight, it left an extremely clear and easily readable trail of characteristic breaks in the crust. An experienced tracker could intuitively understand, from the nature and depth of such a break, how physically exhausted and worn out the wounded animal was, and how soon it could be caught up with. Trappers also paid close attention to how snow actively interacts with the environment and objects. Snow suddenly blown down from tree branches by a gust of wind clearly indicated the recent physical movement of something large beneath them, and the melted wet snow at the base of rocks and boulders eloquently suggested that they accumulated and retained the residual heat of the earth and could serve as a temporary shelter from the cold for an animal. These were subtle details and nuances that critically separated a successful, well-fed hunter from a frozen, hungry failure without prey. The ability to competently read snow like a book was an absolutely fundamental, basic survival skill that was passed down from generation to generation, from father to son orally. This was not just theoretical knowledge from books, but a deep intuitive understanding of the physics of the surrounding world, multiplied by many hundreds of hours of practical observation in the field. Without this critical knowledge of snow, All of a hunter's other numerous skills were practically useless in the winter forest. He was blind to the clues provided by nature. The sun, wind, and changing air temperature constantly, hour by hour, altered the physical properties and structure of the snow cover, and an attentive tracker had to take these dynamic changes into account in his calculations and conclusions. A trail left early in the morning in the frost could look completely different by noon in the sun and be misleading, and only a true master of his craft could mentally reconstruct the original picture of what had happened. It was complex analytical detective work in harsh field conditions without tools, requiring experience and logic. They understood deeply from experience that snow is not a static, dead surface, but a living, constantly breathing organism of nature. It selectively hid some important details and revealed others, depending on the conditions. It could cunningly deceive the inexperienced or generously help the knowledgeable. Understanding its changeable nature and laws meant obtaining the golden key to the secrets of the winter forest and its inhabitants, becoming part of nature. Thus, the very first critical step in successful winter hunting is not a hasty search for animal tracks themselves, but a careful assessment of the canvas of snow on which they are potentially left by nature. The entire further strategy of tracking and the chances of success directly depended on its current state and properties. This was the basis of the craft, the foundation, without a deep understanding of which it was impossible to take a single correct step in the forest in winter. It would be very interesting to hear your balanced opinion on the philosophy of hunting. What exactly do you think about such a profound approach to hunting, where the main thing is not the trophy itself, but the ability to subtly understand and read nature and its language? Write your opinion in detail in the comments below. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of trackers? Once the basic analysis of the snow was complete, the trapper began to study the geometry of the tracks. Each footprint was not just a hole for him, but a whole set of data that had to be correctly deciphered. First, he assessed the outline of the track, its clarity and shape. Sharp, well-defined edges indicated that the track had been left very recently, perhaps just a few minutes ago. If the edges were blurred and smooth by the wind, it meant that hours had passed and the target was far away. The depth of the footprint gave an idea of the weight and condition of the creature. Deep, indented prints indicated a large, heavy animal, or that it was moving slowly and uncertainly. Light, barely noticeable footprints, on the contrary, indicated speed and agility. The distance between individual tracks, or stride length, was a key indicator of speed. Short, closely spaced strides indicated calm, unhurried movement. Long leaps and large distances between prints clearly indicated running and panic. An experienced tracker also analyzed the so-called pattern of the tracks, their relative position. For example, in many animals, when walking calmly, the hind paws fall exactly in the footprints of the front paws, creating a single neat line. If the hind paw prints are ahead of the front ones, this is a sure sign of a fast gallop. The direction of movement was determined not only by the general line of the tracks, but also by the internal details of the print. When moving forward, the snow always shifts slightly in the opposite direction, creating a tiny ridge. It was this ridge that indicated the exact direction to the trapper. Attention was paid to even the smallest details within the print itself. The presence of clear contours of hooves or paw pads, their size and shape made it possible to accurately determine the species of the animal. Sometimes it was even possible to see the prints of individual claws. The trapper always examined several tracks in a chain, not just one. This allowed him to form a general picture, how the speed changed, whether the animal changed direction, whether there were any signs of unusual behavior. One track could be misleading, but a whole trail always told the truth. Analyzing the geometry of a track was similar to the work of a forensic scientist, studying evidence at a crime scene. Each element carried information, and the tracker's task was to piece all these fragments together into a single logical picture. This required extreme concentration and attention to detail. But even a perfectly read trail is only half the battle. What if I told you that there are invisible signs that reveal much more about the target than the clearest footprints? In the next chapter, we'll talk about how trappers read what is hidden from the eyes of ordinary people. Are you ready for the shocking truth about tracking? The most experienced trappers knew that the most important clues were not the tracks themselves, but what surrounded them. They knew how to read invisible signs, the slightest changes in the environment left behind by any creature. One such sign was a barely noticeable ripple in the snow next to a track. It was created by the airflow from a moving body and could reveal even more about its size and speed than the footprint itself. It was almost indistinguishable to a novice, but obvious to a master. Broken branches, bent blades of grass sticking out from under the snow. All of this was part of the story. The trapper paid attention to the height at which the damage was left, which indicated the height of the animal. A fresh break in a branch with drops of resin was a sure sign that the target had passed by very recently. Snow that had fallen from the trees was also an important clue. If there was a fresh, loose snowdrift under a tree that differed from the rest of the snow cover, it meant that someone had recently shaken the branches. The size and shape of this snowdrift could be used to judge the scale of the culprit. Particular attention was paid to feeding and resting places. Gnawed bark on trees and plant remains dug out from under the snow all indicated what the animal had been eating and how long it had been there. This made it possible to understand its habits and predict its further route. Resting places, depressions in the snow where the animal rested, were a real treasure trove of information. The degree of snow compaction and the presence of frost on the edges made it possible to determine how long the creature had been lying there. Its body heat melted the snow, which then froze, creating a characteristic ice crust. Smells also played an important role in this invisible reading. An experienced trapper could pick up the faint scent left by an animal and even determine from it whether it was calm or frightened. The wind was the main helper in this matter, bringing news from afar. Even the silence in the winter forest was informative. If small birds and rodents suddenly fell silent, it could mean the presence of a large predator or a human. The trapper listened not only to sounds but also to their absence. These invisible signs required a completely different level of perception from the tracker. He had to not just look but see, not just listen but hear. He had to become part of this world, feel its rhythm and breath. Thus, tracking turned from simple pursuit into a complex analysis of the environment. The trapper read not only the tracks, but also the entire ecosystem around them. It was the highest form of mastery, available only to a few. What if I showed you how to look into the mind of a wild animal? After reading all the visible and invisible tracks, the trapper moved on to the most difficult stage, psychology. He had to not only follow his target, but think like it in order to predict its next move and be in the right place at the right time. The basis for this analysis was knowledge of the habits and instincts of different animal species. The trapper knew that in a blizzard, most animals seek shelter in thick thickets or lowlands, and on a clear, frosty day, they go out to sunny slopes to warm up. This basic knowledge allowed him to significantly narrow the search area. He also took into account the time of day and natural activity cycles. Some animals are active at dawn and dusk, others throughout the day. Understanding this, the trapper could calculate where the target would be at a certain hour, feeding, resting, or on its way to a watering hole. The terrain played a key role in predicting the route. Animals, like humans, prefer to move along the path of least resistance. They will bypass steep slopes, deep ravines, and impassable windbreaks, choosing existing trails. However, in case of danger, this logic changed. A frightened animal could choose the most difficult and unpredictable route to escape pursuit. Seeing signs of panic in the tracks, the trapper understood that now he had to look for his target in the most unexpected and inaccessible places. Water was another magnet that attracted all living things. Even in winter, when many sources froze over, there were still unfrozen streams or places with thin ice. Knowing the location of such watering holes was a strategic advantage. The trapper constantly asked himself questions. If I were this animal, where would I go? Where would I feel safe? Where would I look for food? He tried to put himself in the shoes of his target, to see the world through its eyes. This process was similar to a game of chess, where the trapper had to think several moves ahead. He did not simply react to the tracks left behind, but acted proactively, trying to intercept his target on its presumed path. This saved energy and time, which were worth their weight in gold. Sometimes the trapper deliberately left a trail of tracks to bypass the target from the other side and test his guess. He could make a big detour to get to the place where, according to his calculations, the animal should appear in a few hours. It was a risky but often justified tactic. Such a deep understanding of the psychology of the target was the pinnacle of a trapper's skill. It transformed hunting from a physical pursuit into an intellectual contest, and the winner was the one who best understood the laws of the wild. What tools, other than his own eyes and knowledge, helped the trapper in this difficult task? In the next chapter, we will look at the equipment without which survival and successful hunting would be impossible. Success in winter hunting on the frontier depended not only on accumulated knowledge and experience, but also on the right, reliable, high-quality equipment. Every item in an experienced trapper's worn leather backpack was carefully selected through years of trial and error, repeatedly tested by harsh conditions, and had its own clear, indispensable purpose for survival. There was absolutely no unnecessary weight here, and there couldn't be, because every gram of cargo had to be carried on one's own back for tens of kilometers through the snow. Saving weight was not a whim, but a necessity. Extra cargo could cost a life in a critical situation when every calorie of energy counted. The basis of a trapper's winter wardrobe was durable clothing, made of natural wool and thick animal fur, which excellently retained precious body heat even when wet, which was critically important. Layering clothing was the main inviolable principle of warmth. Several thin layers of clothing warmed the body more effectively than one bulky thick layer, and allowed for flexible and precise regulation of body temperature during movement, avoiding dangerous overheating and sweating. Pants and jackets were often skillfully made from tanned deerskin, which provided reliable protection from the biting wind and moisture of the snow, and lasted for years with proper care. Footwear was perhaps the most important and critical part of a trapper's survival gear. Trappers traditionally wore comfortable moccasins made of soft tan leather, generously insulated on the inside with fur or thick woolen liners for warmth. Such special footwear was lightweight, unlike boots, completely silent when sneaking up on prey, and allowed the wearer to feel the ground beneath their feet, which was vital for reading tracks and avoiding traps. Heavy boots were impractical for long journeys and made noise, giving away the hunter's position. Wide snowshoes made of wood and leather were absolutely indispensable, necessary for moving through deep, loose snow without trails. They effectively distributed a person's weight over a much larger surface area, physically preventing them from sinking helplessly up to their waist with every step. The design of traditional snowshoes was extremely simple and reliable, proven over centuries. A wooden oval frame made of bent wood, skillfully woven with strong leather straps or sinews into a mesh. Without snowshoes, movement in winter was practically impossible in most places, turning a person into a helpless victim. A sharp knife was a universal, indispensable tool for all occasions, an extension of every trapper's arm in the forest. It could be used to effectively chop branches for a fire, quickly repair torn equipment in the field, skillfully prepare food, and defend against predators. Experienced trappers often had two different knives for different tasks, one large and heavy for rough work such as chopping, and one smaller and sharper for precise, delicate cutting operations. Knives were cherished like the apple of one's eye and constantly sharpened. A flint or flintstone with an iron striker was a vital item for reliably starting a life-saving fire in any conditions. Unlike primitive matches, they were completely unaffected by moisture and dampness, and could help a hunter in the most difficult, critical situations in the rain. The ability to quickly, in a matter of minutes, light a warming fire in any weather, and from damp materials was one of the key basic survival skills in the wild. Without fire, a person was doomed to freeze to death on the very first night in the cold. A metal pot or mug allowed them to effectively melt snow over a fire to obtain clean drinking water anywhere, and prepare hot, warming food from their catch. Hot food not only provided vital energy and calories to the body, but also significantly lifted morale and mood in the harsh conditions of the merciless cold. It was a small, precious element of civilization and comfort in the midst of wild, hostile nature, reminiscent of home and humanity. Weapons, whether heavy flintlock rifles or traditional bows and arrows, required constant care and attention. Gunpowder had to be kept absolutely dry in a leather bag, and bowstrings had to be protected from destructive moisture and lubricated regularly. Every evening at camp, the weary trapper carefully cleaned and checked his weapons for damage, because the successful outcome of the hunt and survival depended directly on their reliability. A misfire at a critical moment could cost him his life when encountering a bear. All this diverse equipment was not just a chaotic set of random items, but a well-thought-out, well-oiled system for survival in extreme conditions. Each element complemented the other in function, creating a unified whole and synergy. The loss of any of these critical items along the way could easily lead to catastrophic, fatal consequences for the trapper, leaving him defenseless against the elements and hunger hundreds of miles from civilization. What if I told you that a hunter's main task is not to find the target, but to avoid being found himself? Once the target had been spotted and its route roughly understood, the most crucial stage began, the approach. Here, the trapper's main weapons were camouflage and the ability to move absolutely silently. The winter landscape seemed to offer the perfect camouflage, the color white. Many trappers used white camouflage capes or simply threw a piece of white cloth over themselves. This allowed them to blend in with the snowy background and become virtually invisible from a distance. However, color was only part of the camouflage. It was much more important to break up the human silhouette, which is easily recognizable against the background of nature. To do this, they attached bundles of dry grass or scraps of fabric to their clothes, which made the contours of the figure blurred and unclear. Movement was the enemy of camouflage, so the trapper moved very slowly, with long pauses. He would take a few steps and then freeze for several minutes, carefully observing and listening to his surroundings. This freeze-and-go tactic not only allowed him to remain unnoticed, but also to better control the situation. The direction of the wind was crucial. The trapper always tried to move against the wind so that his scent would not reach his target. Before going out, he often smoked his clothes with smoke from a fire made of coniferous branches to mask his human scent and replace it with the natural scent of the forest. Every step was measured and careful. The trapper placed his foot slowly, from toe to heel, constantly checking that there were no dry branches under the snow that could crunch. He avoided stepping on crusted snow, choosing areas with loose snow that absorbed sound. Sound discipline was absolute. No talking, no clanking of metal equipment. All items were securely fastened and wrapped in cloth to prevent unnecessary noise. The trapper and his equipment became a single, silent organism. He also used natural sounds to mask his movements. A gust of wind, the sound of snow falling from a tree, a bird's cry. These were all ideal moments to take a few quick but quiet steps. He moved in rhythm with the forest, becoming part of its soundscape. The art of being invisible and inaudible required tremendous patience and self-control. It was a meditative practice in which every movement and every breath was subordinated to a single goal: to get closer to the target without revealing his presence. It was the ultimate demonstration of respect for the one he was following. But what happened when the tracks suddenly disappeared on a rocky plateau or hard surface? In the next chapter, we will examine tactics for situations where the target seems to have vanished into thin air. Even the most experienced tracker could encounter a situation where the trail suddenly ended. This could happen on a section with hard, wind-blown snow, on rocky scree, or on the ice of a frozen river. At this point, the main thing was not to panic, but to apply a systematic approach to the search. First, the trapper would mark the location of the last visible clue. This could be a stick stuck in the snow or simply a notch in a tree. This point became the center from which the search began. Returning to it allowed the trapper to avoid getting lost and to systematize their actions. Next, a methodical search of the area began in an expanding spiral. The trapper slowly moved in circles around the last known point, carefully examining every centimeter of the surface. He looked for the slightest signs: a scratch on a stone, a piece of moss knocked out, a barely noticeable dent in the snow. If the spiral search yielded no results, the trapper would switch to a fan tactic. He would mentally imagine the most likely directions of movement of the target based on the terrain and its previous behavior. Then he would check each of these directions in turn, walking a few hundred meters in a straight line and returning. At the same time, he continued to look not only for the tracks themselves, but also for indirect clues. A bird taking flight, the anxious squeak of a rodent, fresh droppings, all of these could indicate that the target was somewhere nearby. He relied entirely on his heightened senses. If the target was moving across the ice of the river, the trapper carefully examined the opposite bank over a long distance. He looked for a place where the animal could come ashore, paying attention to melted snow at the water's edge or broken ice. It was painstaking work that required vigilance. Sometimes the loss of a trail was not accidental, but a cunning maneuver by the animal. Some species, sensing pursuit, deliberately move on solid surfaces to confuse their tracks. An experienced trapper knew about these tricks and redoubled his vigilance. In such situations, it was important to correctly calculate one's strength and time. A long search in one place could result in the target getting too far away. Sometimes it was wiser to leave that place and try to find fresh tracks in another, more promising area. The trapper trusted his intuition, which was based on years of experience. Sometimes he just felt which direction to search in. It was an irrational but often accurate feeling that helped in the most hopeless situations. Losing the trail was not a defeat, but another puzzle to be solved. It required the trapper to be calm, methodical, and able to think outside the box. It was at moments like these that his true skill was tested. For a true trapper of the Wild West, hunting was not a sport or entertainment, but a means of survival deeply woven into his philosophy. At the heart of this philosophy was a deep respect for nature and for those he pursued. It was an unwritten ethic shared by all experienced hunters. The main principle was to take from nature only what was necessary for life. Trappers never hunted animals for fun or trophies. Each kill was a precious gift that had to be used completely, without waste. He felt connected to the world around him and understood that he was only a part of it, not its master. He knew that his own survival depended directly on the well-being of the entire ecosystem. Therefore, he tried to cause as little harm to the environment as possible. Before starting the hunt, many trappers mentally or verbally asked the spirits of nature for luck and forgiveness. This was not just a ritual, but a way to get in the right frame of mind and feel their responsibility. They understood the seriousness of what they were about to do. Respect was also shown towards the target itself. The trappers strove to do everything as quickly and efficiently as possible so as not to cause unnecessary suffering. He saw the animal not just as prey, but as an equal opponent in the game of survival, worthy of respect. After a successful hunt, the trapper often left a small offering to the spirits of the place. It could be a pinch of tobacco or just words of gratitude. In this way, he closed the circle, giving back to nature a small part of what he had taken. This ethic extended to his attitude toward tracks. The trapper never damaged or destroyed tracks unnecessarily. He understood that this was important information, not only for him, but also for other inhabitants of the forest who also read these signs. They also closely monitored the animal population in their area. If they saw that the number of a certain species was declining, they stopped hunting it, giving it a chance to recover. This was a manifestation of long-term strategic thinking. By sharing their knowledge with young hunters, the elders passed on not only technical skills, but also this philosophy. They taught that the strength of a hunter lies not in his weapons, but in his heart and his attitude toward the world. This was the main lesson that needed to be learned. This approach was radically different from the mindless destruction of resources often practiced by newcomers from the East. The trapper was not a conqueror, but a guardian. He lived in harmony with nature, obeying its laws and rhythms. We see that winter tracking in the Wild West was not just hunting, but a complex science and a high art. It required the trapper to be a criminalist, psychologist, biologist, and survivalist all at once. Every trip into the snowy forest was an intellectual duel where the stakes were extremely high. These people read the snow like an open book, understanding a language inaccessible to the average person. They turned the need to survive into a craft honed to perfection, based on the deepest respect for nature. Their experience is an invaluable legacy, reminding us how multifaceted and informative the world around us can be if we learn to look at it correctly. The history of trappers and trackers teaches us to pay attention to detail, to be patient, and to see the big picture in scattered facts. These are skills that are useful not only in the wild, but also in our everyday lives. They are an example of how a deep knowledge of one's craft can turn a person into a true master. Which of the tracking techniques described in the video did you find most impressive? Perhaps it was reading invisible signs or psychologically predicting the actions of the target? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories about the American frontier.